So far, we have been creating variables of primitive types and objects, and these are standalone variables. Each time you define A, it's an A. You define A1, it's A1. You define A2, it's A2. You cannot use A1 to reference A2, or you cannot use A2 to reference A1. They are all designed to hold only one value at a time. It's not only primitive variable, but also the object variables. Arrays allow us to create a collection of like values that are indexed. An array can store any type of data, but only one type of data at a time. And the array is a list of data elements. So let's look at an example. We actually saw array before. When you create a main method, you have this string array args, and this is how you define an array. You define data type. This can be primitive data type. It can be object, class name, followed by square bracket, empty square bracket, followed by the variable name. Thus, this variable will pointing to an array object, which is a list of data elements of that type. So like int array, int square bracket numbers. Once you create a new array, remember array is an object, a list object of data elements. So you need to create that with a new keyword. Once you create this array, it will have 6 objects because you define 6 here. 6 objects, 6 elements. Each element is one int. If you define as a double, then each element will be a double. If you define this as a circle object, each element will be a object. So you define the array by using the data type or object type, followed by square bracket, and followed by the variable name. Then you create the array by using a new keyword and the data type followed by the number of elements in this array. It is possible to define a reference and create it in the same statement like this. An array may be one of any type, float, char, long, double. And if you define this as object, like a rectangle, numbers equals to something, new rectangle. And apparently, because we discussed the polymorphism, you can also do rectangle, numbers equals to new, square, 6. All these are possible. The array size must be a non-negative number. Apparently, you cannot have negative number. What does the -1 element mean? It may be a literal value, a constant, or variable. So you can define this as a 6, a final, or you can have a variable. You can have a variable entered from the user. If I say I want to have, you can ask the user, how many elements do you want in this array? If the user says 10, then you will int number equals to new count, which count is the number of elements that the user input. Once created, however, an array size is fixed and cannot be changed. An array is accessed by the reference name and the subscript that identify which element you want to use. And remember, it starts with 0. Array element can be treated as any other variable. They are simply accessed by the same name and the subscript. So let's bring up Eclipse. So this is the array demo 1. And here you can see you are going to define a hours of array of integer, 3 integer. And we are creating 3 integers. Employee equals to 3. So we have 3 integers. Each one is accessed by a subscript. You are referencing them like hours 1, hours 0, hours 1, hours 2. And remember, the first one starts at 0, right? You can also use a variable to access array. So here, as long as your index has a value 0 or 1 or 2, you can use the same. You can use it the same manner as you use our 0, 1, 2. Now here, remember, array has 3 elements and it has 3. This will be starting at 0, so it will be 0, 1, 2. The index must be less than array size minus 1. Must be less than or equal to array size minus 1. So here, when you have 3 elements, you can only use 0, 1, 2. 2 is 3 minus 1, right? Similarly, when you reference using the variable, you will start with 0. And then you will use this index less than the count. Less than the count means it goes from 0 to the count minus 1, the array size minus 1. That's why in the for loop, we said prior that it's more common to use an index starting at 0 instead of at 1. This is the reason, because a lot of times you are going to process array inside the loop. And naturally, there will be a question. What if anything goes beyond the array size? Array's index always start at 0 and continue all the way to array length minus 1. Like if you have an array of 10, then it should be starting from 0 to 9. If you try to reference in array 10, what will happen? So here, you have a size of 3, array size of 3, and what if you access size of 3? So index less than 4, right? So in the last execution, last loop, you will be setting this value 3 equals 10. And you see that invalid subscription error. The Java virtual machine will tell you you are referencing an array element that does not exist, is out of the boundary. In for loops, it's typical to use like I, j, or k as counting variable and start from 0 to array's length minus 1. And it's very easy to be off by 1 when accessing arrays like here. This is very common. It's not only very easy, it's also very common to have this error. Always start from 0 and use I less than the size, which will bring from 0 to the size minus 1, right? The equal sign here allows loop to continue on index 100, while 99 is the last index. So when relatively few items need to be initialized, an initialization list can be used. You can do it this way. And so that's 0 is 31, element 1 is 28, and element 2 is 31, and element 3 is 30, etc., etc. Apparently, you will recognize what this means, right? This is the list of days in the month. You can also define array this way: int number with square bracket. This is I would say I would not recommend you use this way. What's the reason? Because in general, you want to start with the definition, the real definition of the variable. If you put right here, you are splitting int and square bracket into 2, which actually means you are splitting one definition and place it into 2 different places. This can cause confusion. And also, it's more apparent that if I define this way, you are defining the int, one array, another array, and a regular variable, a singular variable. This can cause confusion. This definitely can cause confusion. And people will start to wonder, because this naming is scarce, it's a plural. Does that mean you are missing a square bracket? it's likely that you are actually missing a square bracket. Whereas here, you define an array and the numbers, codes, and scores, they are all plural. They are apparently all arrays. So in general, we always recommend you to write an array with square bracket first before the variable name, instead of putting the square bracket after the variable name. You can see that this way, it's more easier to make mistakes. When you try to process array content, you just process an array is the same as other variable. You just do this, defining this array and use the whole part of array name plus subscript within the square bracket. It's the same as any other processing. Like if I look at the pay array code, you're defining this hours with a number of employee equals to 5, so it will be start from 0 to 4. And you are using this for loop 0, starting at 0 and at less than 5, which means it will end at 4. And this is how you access that. You use this array name plus subscript equals to something, and later on, you will use this in another expression. But here you are not assigning value to it. Instead, you are reading from this array element and utilizing that in the expression. And again, this is starting from 0 to 1 less than employee, the number of the counting employee. And array elements can be used in relational operations like this. And also in loop conditions. Basically, these are just Boolean conditions. So if you just consider this array element as a regular variable, but it gives you the power to do the same operation on multiple variables, multiple elements in one array. That's the power of it. And we have been talking about going through the size of this array, right? You start at 0 and end with 1 less than the size. A lot of times you would like to know the size of the array length. Array is an object and provide a public field called length. Again, this length is not immutable. Array itself is immutable, and array length is also immutable. Because array is immutable, you cannot change the length. So the length is immutable. It's a constant that can be tested, can be used as if it's a regular variable. So you can define something like double 25, then the array length is 25. You get the length by calling the length field. Remember, this is a field. It's different from string. In string, a length is a method, so it follows with a bracket, parentheses. In array, length is a field, so it comes without the parentheses. Why this is happening? I think that's just because someone, when they developed Java, they didn't think this through and didn't do it well. So there will be a confusion. And for us, we have to just accept the fact that this is length is a field, and array length is a field, and you cannot use parentheses. But if it's for a string, length is a method, and you have to use a parenthesis. That's something you have to remember. And if you cannot remember, I would say this is more like a poor design that you have to adopt to it. So a common way of utilizing string, of using that array, is like this. In the for loop, you define starting at 0 and use a less than array.length. Then use this array name plus subscript to reference inside the loop. This is the most common way, most traditional way of utilizing array. And we will be using this format in most of our cases. And you can also let the user specify the size. Like we said before, you can get the size from nextInt, from keyboard, and create your array based on the variable.